Much to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Wellington, New Zealand, is Imam Mustenser Qamar. He's the Minister of Religion of the Worldwide Ahamadiyaa Muslim Community. Also with us from Charleston, South Carolina, here in the United States, is Mohammed Fraser-Rahim. He's the Executive Director of North America for Quilliam International, a counter-terrorism organization. Here with us in the studio is Qasim Rashid. He's an author, human rights activist, and attorney. From Pittsburgh, Colin Clarke is an assistant teaching professor with the Institute of Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University and a senior research fellow with the Soufan Center. Welcome to all of you to the show. Imam Qamar, let me start with you. What can you tell us about how the Muslim community in Christchurch is recovering from this tragedy and coming to terms with this horrific attack last week?
Assalamu alaikum, may peace be upon you. Well, obviously this horrific attack has impacted all Muslims across New Zealand, not only in Christchurch, and we've all either directly or indirectly been impacted, and obviously our sentiments and prayers go out to the victims and families. There's a sense of fear and anxiety and concern at the same time across the Muslim community in New Zealand, but at the same time the response we've got from the general public is of acceptance and love, and that's really encouraging and comforting. But there are issues that need to be addressed as well, which have come to light from this. A couple of years ago there was a study done here in New Zealand, it was based in New Zealand, of over 16,000 people, and the study concluded that the more avid a newsreader one is here in New Zealand, the more likely they are to hold anti-Muslim sentiments and reduced warmth towards Muslims. So it's really concerning, and obviously this is a depiction of that as well.
And Imam Qamar, could you tell us about security at mosques in the country right now?
Well, the police have been working closely with all mosques across New Zealand, including our mosque. We've got the largest purpose-built mosque in New Zealand, and there's been armed police there. The mosque isn't fully back to normal yet. The police are obviously providing security as much as possible. We've had the evening prayers just yesterday as well, and at the moment we've opened the mosque only for evening prayers. But we'll be working closely with the police going forward. Obviously, the government's got a big responsibility in providing security for all members of society, including Muslims, and making sure that we feel safe when we do go to the mosques and worship.
Right, let's bring in Mohammed Fraser-Rahim. Mohammed, the gunman left behind a 74-page manifesto. He describes himself as a white nationalist. How widespread is this ideology in the world? Is it getting into the mainstream now?
Yes, I mean, what we've seen is that just off of FBI data recently and other social science research is that we know white supremacism or domestic terrorism, individuals who use twisted interpretation of Christianity, and certainly just white supremacists more broadly, have been on the rise. It's something that we certainly see that, unfortunately, in the Trump White House, they haven't been quite clear on calling it out for the label for what it is. And so this is a concern. I can tell you, as someone who formerly worked in the U.S. government for over a decade at the National Counterterrorism Center, I would have been working on these issues domestically speaking, as well as the broader issue of transnational terrorism. So I think that the fact that I'm still working these problem sets on the outside and also have been a former government analyst shows that we still have a lot of work to do. We have to remain hopeful, but this is certainly a rising trend. And it's not just in the United States. Certainly we see in New Zealand, we're seeing in Europe, and other places throughout the world as well.
Qasim, Islamophobia has become ubiquitous. We hear it from the White House, we hear it from other leaders around the world, we hear it from even popular talk show hosts on television here in this country. How does that contribute to the kind of atmosphere, the environment that we see now?
Well, one of the most frustrating things that we saw after this attack was that people expressed shock that this attack had happened. If you ask any Muslim, any person of color, anyone who's already in a marginalized community, they'll tell you that what else did you expect when you have the president referring to Syrian refugees as serpents and immigrants as invaders, when Tucker Carlson calls Iraqis primitive monkeys. When you dehumanize a people and you turn a blind eye to the rising white nationalism and white supremacy that's engulfing our country. I mean, according to the Department of Homeland Security, to the FBI, to the active duty military members, and to the police forces in the United States. 4 different security entities all agree that white supremacy terrorism is the single greatest threat to America right now. And you have a president who says, it's not that big of a deal.
Right.
That's a dynamic and dangerous combination, and it's going to result in more extremism. Just now, a report came out that another white supremacist entered a mosque in Phoenix and threatened to kill them, and fortunately he was arrested. But until and unless leadership acts with justice, upholds the rule of law, and ensures that all citizens, regardless of faith or no faith, are treated with safety and security, my fear is that these kinds of attacks are going to continue.
And there's also a difference, Qasim, in the way these things are treated. On the one hand, if we see white nationalists carry out crimes like this, it's treated as a crime,
right.
Whereas if we get it the other way around, where a radical Muslim carries out a crime, is immediately branded a terrorist. The labels are put on them.
Not only are the labels, but then the media attention is put on it. If a Muslim, I mean, statistically speaking, looking at the media as a whole over the last several decades, if a Muslim commits an act of violence, he receives 7 times more attention than if a white supremacist does so as well. So this creates this fear in society that Muslims are somehow more prone to violence. And I'll add this point. The Anti-Defamation League's report from 2018 shows that 100% of the Americans killed last year by a terrorist were killed by a white supremacist terrorist. And so for us to continue to defund efforts to de-radicalize white supremacists is ultimately destroying our own country. In my district, where I'm running for Virginia State Senate, the KKK is handing out flyers to recruit people and to intimidate Black Americans. This is unacceptable, and anyone who tolerates this needs to be held accountable. That includes social media companies who don't shut down white supremacists and white nationalists, and government agencies or government officials who look the other way when these types of people commit terrorism, because they're ultimately harming our country, and that bleeds over, literally and figuratively, to other parts of the world, like what we saw in New Zealand.
All right, let me bring in Colin Clarke. Colin, we have this violent ideology which is spreading around the world. The man who was arrested in New Zealand for these shootings, was a lone gunman. That's what we know right now. Apparently he belonged to no group and was not on any kind of police or security watch list. So how difficult does that make it to track people like this, to try and prevent attacks like this?
Yeah, well, it certainly makes the issue more difficult, more challenging. But what we do know is that very often these, what are initially thought to be lone wolves, are acting as part of a broader network. And indeed, this is not a domestic issue. This is not a parochial issue in the US, the UK, Canada, et cetera. This is a truly transnational problem, and it needs to be met with a transnational response. And I think, finally, at least I know in the academic and in the policymaking community, people's eyes have been open to that. We now have to hope that that happens at the government level, and that we use this very robust counterterrorism infrastructure that we've built since 9/11 to share intelligence and to cooperate on the rising threat of right-wing terrorism and extremism.
Colin, you talk about the robust government infrastructure that was built after 9/11, but isn't it a problem to use those laws, to implement those kinds of strategies when the crimes that are committed are not considered terrorism?
Yeah, so I think that gets to what the issue is, whether, we need to call this unambiguously what it is. Any act of political violence is terrorism, put simply. And so I think there needs to be a real, reassessment of what we consider terrorism. And I'll tell you, I've been called at least 3 times in the last year and a half to go testify on Capitol Hill about the threat from jihadi terrorism. I'd like to see similar hearings held on the threat from violent right-wing extremism. I haven't seen them yet. I'm hoping that's going to change in the near future.
Imam Qamar, the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, she met with mourners in Wellington, and on Friday she made a statement. This is what she had to say. Let's watch this.
New Zealand has been chosen because we are not a place where violent extremism exists. We reject those notions, and we must continue to reject them. This is not an enclave for that kind of behaviour, for that kind of ideology. We will and must reject it. This is a place where people should feel secure and will feel secure.
So, Imam Qamar, the Prime Minister has been praised for the very mature, very compassionate, caring way in which she's handled this crisis. She's made these proposals about new gun laws in New Zealand. But what else does she have to do to make Muslims feel safe in New Zealand again?
I mean, obviously the immediate response from the Prime Minister has been really comforting as well, to know that she's immediately responded with gun law reforms coming as well. Even her message to the President of the United States, Donald Trump, as well, was very reassuring as well. So, but the thing is, going forward, I think we need to work together to root out such extremism, such terrorism, and root it out from society. Obviously, there is a trickle effect, and what happens around the world affects what happens here as well. And people are influenced by what's happening in Western countries around the world and the rise of far-right movements. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago at the Peace Symposium held in London, the Caliph of the Worldwide Ahamadiyaa Muslim Community, His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad, also mentioned the rise of far-right movements and warned of this as well, and talked about solutions towards this. And just after this attack in New Zealand, in the press release, he mentioned that this tragic event should serve as a lesson and warning to other countries of the developed world that we must join together to tackle all forms of racial, ethnic and religious hatred with wisdom and with a firm hand. So going forward, I think we're going to have to work closely with the government as well to rooting out this problem.
If I could add to that, it's crucial that government plays a significant role, but my message is also to the ordinary citizens. It's not just enough that you're not racist, you have to be anti-racist. You have to actively work with people of color, work with Muslims, work with immigrants, work with Jews to root out the anti-Semitism, the anti-Muslim bigotry, the racism that is permeating the landscape. Because right now, racism is a very profitable business. It gets clicks, it gets news headlines, people pay attention to it. What they don't pay attention to are Muslims and Jews coming together for a prayer vigil. What they don't pay attention to are people resolving their differences peacefully. And because it's not profitable, because it's not wild and spectacular, it's much more difficult to get attention and get people involved. But that's why we have to work that much harder to organize. And so my message is, don't wait for your local politician to do something. Take the initiative yourself, knock on your neighbor's door, call the local synagogue, the local church, the local mosque, and have those conversations. Because until and unless we take ownership over these conversations, we allow white nationalists, whether it's white nationalists or Daesh terrorists, we allow them to write the narrative for us, and we just can't expect that to be a good and successful way forward.
All right, but Qasim, rhetoric and sentiment has to change at the top as well. I mean, we just heard earlier in the program that there's been no hearings in Congress over this kind of violence.
None. And as a matter of fact, the current White House administration has defunded nonprofit organizations like Life After Hate, who are working to de-radicalize white supremacists. So not only are they ignoring it on Capitol Hill, but they're actively taking resources away from those organizations. And this is why I think especially young people who have a very poor history of voting need to get actively involved in the civic process. The 18 and 29 demographic in America, less than 20% of them vote. If that went to 60%, they could swing every election in the country and implement these kinds of reforms that we all want. I mean, we talk about gun control, 93% of Americans want universal background checks. Yet it hasn't come for a vote yet in Congress. And the reason for that is because the people who have the power aren't looking at the people who are suffering. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has a great quote, that those who are closest to the pain should be closest to the power. But unfortunately, they're not right now. So if the people at the top aren't being responsible, my message is for the citizens to be active, involved in the civic process, and replace them with people who will uphold justice and safety for all people.
Mohammed Fraser-Rahim, the 28-year-old man who was arrested, what are your thoughts on how he used social media? This attack was broadcast live on Facebook, and even before Facebook could take it, I think it took something like 17 or 18 minutes before Facebook realized that this was on the air, before they could take it down. He was spreading terror using this social media network. What can be done about that?
So, I mean, this effort requires social media, or I should say, companies like Facebook and Twitter to be involved. I mean, as my previous panelists have mentioned, this is a whole of society approach. I mean, but we have precedents to this as well. If we look at someone like the English ideologue Anwar al-Awlaki, he has been immortalized in his grave more than when he was alive. I mean, I am in Charleston, South Carolina right now, where in 2016, a white nationalist, Dylan Roof, murdered 9 African-American individuals. And he, in his manifesto, the individual that we shouldn't even name, he utilized and he mentioned Dylan Roof as one of the individuals who motivated his actions. So I think what we have are lessons that we can learn from jihadist extremism, lessons that we've learned from white national extremists from the past, that we can find corrective measures to reform these activities as well. What I also want to add as well, and I think is certainly important, is that once these individuals are arrested or incarcerated too as well, we have to find rehabilitative measures to address these concerns. My organization is one organization out of many organizations that are out there who are working to rehabilitate individuals. We just came out with a documentary about the steps of how do you help individuals after they have been former extremists in all its fashion, whether they're white nationalists or they're jihadist extremists. How do you combat this? Unfortunately, there is not a coordinated effort by the U.S. government in terms of a purposeful de-radicalization program, whether they are Islamists or jihadists or whatever framing we want to use that terminology, or if they are white nationalists. And that needs to be taken seriously at the state level and at the federal level for us to see real changes. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, the individual who carried out these actions, he will not face the death penalty. There is not a death penalty inside New Zealand. So when the question comes up, not just in New Zealand or in other European nation states or in the United States as well, right, what happens when individuals are incarcerated for these crimes as well?
Colin, what are your thoughts on how an organization, a corporation like Facebook monitors this, polices this? It's very difficult. I mean, there's a fine line between controlling what's the content that's on these networks and censorship, I guess.
Yeah, I think we've seen a sea change in the last year or two, at least in terms of the will to do something about it. Now, there are technical aspects that involve algorithms, writing code, potentially using artificial intelligence to remove postings, and I think that's very much still a work in progress. I do have some colleagues that work for these social media companies that I can say on good faith are very much dedicated and devoted to making a difference here. That's why they left their former jobs. But again, I think there's a lag effect between the time where we actually, identify this as a problem and by the time we start seeing results. It is ironic, I'll point out, that one of your guests is calling from from Charleston, South Carolina. I'm here speaking to you from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we had the horrific Tree of Life synagogue shooting. So two of the guests are joining you from cities where there have been devastating acts of terrorism committed by right-wing extremists. Those data points alone should tell you what a problem this is.
If I could add to that, I think one of the issues that social media companies need to recognize is that not everything can be profitable. It goes back to my point earlier. It isn't profitable for them to have to hire another 1,000 analysts to be able to write code, write the algorithms, and simply monitor what's happening. It isn't profitable for them to have to implement protocols where it makes it more difficult for people to upload content to ensure that it isn't content like this horrific mass shooting terrorist attack that we saw. But it's necessary. It's a fundamental necessity because we live at a time now where one lunatic in one corner of the world can upload terrorist propaganda, and now it is impacting 7 billion people worldwide. And so you have a company like Facebook, for example, who is worth, I don't know, $40 billion, whatever the number is right now. If they are going to utilize our ad revenue, our eyeballs, our attention, then there needs to be an accountability for it. And this is a very simple principle. If I go into any kind of retail store and start yelling racial epithets and start making death threats, the store will kick me out. There's no question about it. They should, and they should probably have me arrested. So why is it any different if somebody goes on social media and says, target that particular demographic and kill them? It should be the same philosophy. And if social media giants aren't willing to accept responsibility for the way their product is used, just as every other organization is, then there needs to be more involvement. And I don't want this to happen because I love the free market, but if they're causing the deaths of people and not being accountable to them, there needs to be a breaking point where the government steps in and makes them accountable. Yeah, right.
Qasim, we've got a few minutes left, but you're getting involved in this yourself. I mean, you're running for office in Virginia, for the Senate.
Absolutely.
The state Senate in Virginia. What would you like to bring to this debate?
Well, I think first and foremost is we need to have laws that are based on justice. And we need to, especially in this aspect of racism, the problem with racism in America today is that we never had a reckoning. We never had a healing. After Nazi Germany collapsed, the Germans had a reckoning. They paid reparation to the survivors of the Holocaust, and they tore down Nazi memorabilia and Nazi statues. In the United States, in the Jim Crow era, well after the Civil War ended, we built white supremacist monuments. Last January, my opponent actually praised Robert E. Lee, who was a general for the Confederate Army, fighting for slavery, fighting for white supremacy.
Right.
So what kind of a message are we sending if we are still celebrating the terrorists who try to destroy our nation? So what I would bring to this candidacy is a leadership based on justice that represents truly all people, as opposed to those who rebelled against the United States.
Imam Qamar, getting back to what the New Zealand government is trying to do now, there have been efforts in New Zealand to change the gun laws. There was an effort in 2005, 2012, and 2017. All those efforts failed. What's different this time?
I mean, obviously, the incident that's just happened is different, and it's obviously called for that need for gun reform as well. But I mean, earlier, Brother Qasim was speaking about the community as well, and I wanted to comment on that and the involvement of the community towards bettering the situation. Across New Zealand, we've been running a True Islam campaign as well, under the guidance of the Worldwide Caliph, which is running in many countries across the world, including in the US as well. We have the trueislam.nz campaign running across New Zealand, where we're trying to highlight some of the common misunderstandings which lead to issues like this and the rise of far-right movements. And we're addressing these. We've been addressing these for quite a few years across New Zealand. We've been running different campaigns, peace symposiums, interfaith dialogues. We've even just a couple of days ago, I was invited to a church as a memorial to what happened in Christchurch as well. So there's a lot of interfaith things going on as well to help improve the situation already.
Mohammed Fraser-Rahim, I've just got about 45 seconds left. Very early days in the investigation in New Zealand. So far what we know was that police believe this was a lone gunman, but could that change?
Yeah, I think, you know, as a previous colleague mentioned on the panel, I think that there has to be coordinated efforts across various government agencies. Certainly the Five Eyes communities will certainly work in concert with one another. I would say that at a minimum, we know that he could have been a self-starter. We push back on the language of maybe being a lone wolf. I think there's always someone who's behind an action and a motivation too as well.
Okay. We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.